We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people since time immemorial. So as we acknowledge the land in which we stand, it's actually a very fitting attribute of the conversation that we intend to have today. I want to give a couple of housekeeping notes. The use of the chat feature will be your most available way to participate and engage. And at certain points, we may invite someone to speak a question or idea or concept. My colleague, Stacey Wegley, will be monitoring the chat. And I also want to mention that anyone who has called in other words, you're not on your laptop or a device other than your phone, please enter into the chat the last 4 digits of your phone number, as well as your name. You can find Tiffany directly and send her a direct message, or you can simply send it to everyone. And, we'll ensure that you are included in our breakout sessions, and also we'll be able to acknowledge you from your chat. So I want to start off by sharing a little bit of a story of when we did this particular session another time with our friends and allies with Wellbeing in the Nation. We were talking about stock and concealed stories, and there was this woman from the business sector. So she didn't work in our field and in our sector. And, a lot of times, as you well know, when you cross sectors and you begin to communicate and engage with people in a completely different sector, there's all those issues around language and terminology and, just understanding, if you will. And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I heard about this at one of our previous gatherings, this idea of narrative change." And you could tell by her voice that it was very intriguing to her. If we could all go on mute, while we're on, we'd appreciate it. So the woman was very intrigued by the idea of narrative change, but she admitted, "I didn't quite get what it was and what it is." And so I think one of the reasons this particular session is so important is for us to realize that a part of our role as change agents is that we're in the business of conversion from what currently exists to what we would like to see realized in our communities, in our families, and in the lives of those whom we touch and see on a daily basis. And this conversion needs to happen not only on the surface, but also at great depths within our culture, the thinking, and even the subconscious of individuals and groups in our communities. And so I want to begin by sharing with you a quote from a writer, Andy Goodman. And he says, "We must remember that the battle for the hearts and minds of the people starts with the hearts." And so in this quote, which I love, it captures the idea that the heart is where we want to begin our understanding of narrative change. Like most of us, many of you are becoming familiar with the idea that there's something important and almost magical about the combination of data and story in advancing the cause of advancing health, well-being, and equity in our communities. We've arrived at a point where getting that first well-crafted, well-honed infographic, which is literally the tangible representation of data and story, is literally a benchmark for us. And so, we feel great about that. We've got entire data platforms such as Community Commons, which are uniquely designed to be a combination with search engines and stories about the good work that's happening in communities. And so we're going to delve deeper into this idea of the power of stories. Next slide, please. In learning about narrative change, we're going to first look closely at the story side of the equation. Recently, it seems a growing number of us have rediscovered the power of stories and how we capture our awareness, touch our hearts, and literally make us feel something in that moment. A narrative at its simplest level is a collection of stories that hang together fairly well to represent a bigger, fuller story, a picture of a point of view, a way of life, a way of viewing the world. Here, we'll begin by looking at two particular types of stories, what are referred to as stock and concealed stories. Next slide, please. So we're going to begin with stock stories first. Now, I want to, over the next several slides, I want to invite my colleagues to read the captions on the slide. And we're going to share with you a few stock stories that have actually laid the foundation of our national and collective narrative, our national sense of self. So take a moment and take in these very familiar lines.
The land of opportunity.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
All men are created equal.
A nation of laws.
So take a minute and just reflect on those stock stories. These are national level stories. And so now that we have some words and ideas to define stock stories, let's look at some other examples of stock stories from our nation. In the chat, or if you'd like to, chat in what are some other examples of stock stories that you know for our nation? Or in addition to that, what are some examples of stock stories for your individual communities? Whatcom, San Juan, the islands. If you'd like to speak into the larger group, unmute yourself and we will call on you. What are some stock stories for your individual communities? Lisa mentions that everyone can pull themselves up and by their bootstraps, right? And then there's this stock story about the deserving poor. Meritocracy, that this is, our nation is a meritocracy in many of our individual professions. The American dream. Great examples here. Now, many of these stock stories live at the national level, but as I mentioned a minute ago, we've got individual stock stories at the community level as well. My good friend at San Juan, in San Juan shared with me, the stock story for us is that we are at Lopez Island, we are a vacation community, harmonious and homogeneous, and mostly everyone's doing just fine. That's a local stock story. Here's another stock story. I love this, Elizabeth. People in groups experiencing health disparities did something to create their own situation. Everyone has an equal chance to be successful. I did it, Elise. Why can't they do it? And so here's an individual community stock story from Bellingham, the city of subdued excitement. Katie, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and tell us a little bit about the subdued excitement in Bellingham. Katie, can you unmute for a minute?
Oh goodness, I don't know if you can hear me, but this is just the slogan for Bellingham. I don't know how it was chosen, but when I think about it, I guess what it means to me is Bellingham is known for excitement that's like people find their own excitement. You go outside and do things. It's not necessarily known for clubbing or big parties per se. And so I guess that influences how people choose to socialize and choose to find community. It's a bit more subdued and maybe harder to find than in another city.
All right.
I'm
Definitely
stretching.
Definitely sounds like there might be a stock story there. See if you can hold on to that example and see if it bears itself out to be a true stock story as we work through a better understanding of what stock stories are. Our Bellingham folks are definitely leaning in. In Bellingham, there are definite stories about what other communities in Whatcom County are like and who's in them. So I'm channeling our good friend John Powell in terms of us and them, the othering of others. You know, a lot often stock stories at a deeper level of analysis become us and them kind of stories. Bellingham is progressive. There aren't any racists here. Race and ethnicity described as a risk factor. So just by who and what I am by birth, I'm already a risk factor. And I want to thank those who are chatting in from their phone lines. Please be sure to include your name as well. And I think Tiffany's inviting some folks. Please look at the chat to see who's being invited to share your name to go with your phone line. So let's take a look at what stock stories are. Next slide, please. Stock stories. We've got a bit of a definition here. And what it says, stock stories give meaning and understanding to a way of life. They help the individual to find their place in society or in a culture or in a subculture. They create a type of social cohesion. We relate to people based on our stock stories, but it also determines who we don't relate to as well. A very powerful effect of stock stories, particularly those that are held by the majority of folks, is that they help to maintain the status quo. So these are the characteristics of stock stories. And in a minute, you're going to have a chance to go into some breakout rooms and talk a little bit more. You don't get often enough time to talk in the large group, but you're going to have a chance to talk in breakouts about not only stock stories, but what are also now, if you go to the next slide, concealed stories. All right, so one of the best ways for us to understand what concealed stories are is just by simply giving you examples of what they are. And so I want to invite somebody to read the very first stock story on the left and then the concealed story on the right. To give you the picture of it, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the stock story. A concealed story, one concealed story on the right is genocide and land stealing. All men are created equal is a stock story, and yet African Americans were designated as 3/5 of human beings from the founding of our nation. The land of opportunity is the stock story. Slavery, oppression, and economic exploitation is in our concealed stories. A nation of laws is the stock story. The concealed story there is that those laws are unequally applied. And if you want evidence of that, spend a day, a week, an hour in one of our criminal justice systems, our judicial systems. We the people is the stock story, and yet for those who wrote it at the time in which that was written, was largely referring to white males. So these are the examples of concealed stories, many of which can counteract the very same stock stories in which they're listed, with. And I see, wow, we still got stock stories in concealed stories coming in. I love it. You all are going to have some very good dialogue in your breakouts in just a minute. But I want you to spend a minute, and I want you to think before we go on to the next slide. What are some of the reasons or ways in which a concealed story counteracts a stock story? Think about that. Give that some thought. And in just a minute, I'm going to share with you some characteristics of concealed stories. So next slide, please. Concealed stories. They disrupt the meaning and symbolism of the stock stories. So disrupting the meaning, they counteract, they flow against, whether it's literal meaning or symbolic meaning. They're often a game changer for individuals. You know, once you begin to take in, and in some cases begin to witness, the reality of these little known, lesser known stories, they dramatically alter your worldview. They may, so much so that they may lead to despondency, certainly a deeper level of questioning, as well as potentially social disintegration. A number of us have been so disenchanted by a lot of what we've witnessed and seen just over the past several months, as some of our very sacred stock stories as a nation have been questioned right in front of our eyes and right on videotape and pumped into our living rooms every evening. Now, the good news is that this despondency, this social disintegration is a stage and it's a phase, you know, ideally and hopefully before a period of reintegration, all right? If you hold the circle as a true symbol of life, then things come full circle to a point where we get to re-engage and reintegrate in society in a deeper, more meaningful way. The last characteristic of a stock story or concealed story is that they reveal the inadequacy of the stock story to represent the full truth. So with that, we're going to send you into some breakouts now, and we've got a few questions we want you to discuss. There should be only about 3 or 4 members within your breakout session, but here they are. What are the stock and concealed stories surrounding COVID-19 and the calls for racial justice that we've witnessed both in our nation and in our local communities? One of the things that I've recognized in working with communities across the country and living in my own community is the narratives are very, very different. They're very different, you know. And then the next question is, what are these stock and concealed stories revealing about your community? So in addition to talking about the national narrative and the comparisons of stock and concealed, talk about your very community. Spend some time talking about the narratives in your own communities, because please realize that a number of you obviously are going to be from different communities. You may notice some distinctions of the narratives that are playing in each of one of your relatives' communities. And then before we wrap up, you'll have about 15 minutes, I believe. Before we wrap up, ask yourselves the question, are stock stories wrong? Or are they right? Just kind of spend some time with that question. We'll revisit these on the other side of the breakout. So in just a minute, or at this moment, Tiffany's going to send you into your breakouts, treat these questions, and we'll be seeing you on the other side of the breakout. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. How were your discussions? I hope they were well. I'm literally going to invite you, should you have something to say, because we're going to move into a little bit of a vocal portion for a debrief here. We're going to revisit the questions, but we're going to ask you to share both in chat as well as in spoken word, if you choose to, what stood out for you during the discussions? You know, what kind of landed and resonated with you, you know, that as something kind of striking that you may not have thought about or heard before? in terms of either stock and concealed stories?
One thing our group discussed was in talking about whether stories are right or wrong, was, really defining terms about, do we mean some sort of moral truth or do we mean factually accurate? And that, by their nature, most stories are not inclusive, right? I mean, you have some sort of protagonist, or group. And so that, most of these stories, in a sense, could be right to somebody while not being factually accurate.
Great point. Nat, who are you? What's your organization?
I'm a registered nurse at Unity Care in Bellingham.
Great, appreciate it. I'm also looking at the chat. I see Mary Jo made a comment, heard from another the impact a personal story can have rather than challenging the stock story. Mary Jo, would you like to say a little bit about that comment and what you mean by that?
Sure, and that was not my comment, but it's true. We started at a place of, how ironic is it that some folks who refuse to wear masks because it's an infringement on their civil rights do not recognize that the move for racial justice, is about basic civil and human rights. And so that's where you could get into a situation where you're challenging that stock story that people believe. And a lot of times when you challenge people, immediately your dukes go up, right? And there's not going to be any understanding to come out of it. But to offer a personal story, someone's life experience, hopefully has a better chance of having that other person or community at least give some real serious thought to how their opinions are perhaps limited by only looking at their own experience.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. What it sends me to is this idea that in our work, when we talk about narrative change, changing a narrative is inclusive of those one-on-one exchanges and experiences. I attended the Racial Equity Institute's 2-day training, as well as their groundwater training. And I literally went there with the intention of wanting to have a greater command of the subject matter of equity for exchanges just like that. I literally wanted a greater command because I feel like there's a lot of us who on a gut level and an intuitive level kind of sense and know what's right, but we're not always prepared for those individual moments. Now, a narrative change is really about the whole and the collective, right? And in our work, how do we do things, or a little later, we're going to talk about the infrastructure of narrative change. I'm saying, how do we set ourselves up to be active agents and players in a broader arc of changing the stories that dominate, our communities and our culture? Thank you, Mary Jo, for sharing that. I also see Niles, discussion about concealed stories. What narratives or groups does the concealed story protect? That's a useful way for me to identify and define concealed stories. Totally great point, Niles. And, stock and concealed stories, whether intentionally or unintentionally, absolutely identify groups of people that fall in camps and have a protective feature on the stock side, particularly of what? The status quo. And someone's trying to answer the question they can be about whether a stock story is right or wrong. It says they can be both. Stock stories can be beliefs, however, proven differently with facts. So great comments here. All right, and one from Liz. Stock stories intend to keep alternative stories from emerging. So Liz is naming literally a bit of a repulsive effect, a dampening effect on the concealed stories. Great point. there's a lot of great points here. I want to invite anyone who'd love to share. It's not just dependent, on, us picking you out, Stacy or Elizabeth, anyone that you see that you might want to call out as well?
One of the things I was finding interesting in one of the conversations here is, again, sort of taking it down to the personal level for some who's in the room, right? This stock story that people who work from home are lucky doesn't capture all the challenges faced by the families and individuals where, or does working from home actually translate, I'm living at work? So it's a little different step outside of the sort of racial justice conversation, perhaps, but one of the current realities and emerging stories.
Great point. Great point. I was also struck by a very simple, it looks like stock story that Beth is lifting up at United General. She says, similarly, telehealth solves access to care issues for people. So, that's so succinct and great and wonderful, because I get exactly what she's saying with that, and stock stories can live within individual organizations and subcultures as much as they can at the broader level, and this is one where I believe Beth is saying that's only half the story. Individuals have far more issues, in health than just what they can get across a telehealth line. Great point. Any other comments? We're going to invite an open mic comment before we transition into another round of examining stock and concealed stories and how they can work for us. Anyone want to lift their own voice up on something they're noticing either in their breakout session or in this line of conversation overall?
David, this is Liz. I'll jumpstart everybody. I think another stock story, anybody who wants a job can find a job.
Whoa.
And, just the contradiction and the tension between that and some of the debates about supporting unemployment right now.
Right.
We still hold on to that notion. Anybody who wants to work could work.
Yeah. Totally, unfounded, and then this is why data and stories are what I call the 1-2 punch. The problem is a lot of times we don't have that data immediately accessible or at the tip of our tongue. But, there is such a thing as willful ignorance, as we're all learning, these new terms, and certain things that come up, as stock stories probably fall into that camp. Thanks, Liz, for sharing that. And here it is. Are stock stories wrong or are they right? Again, I want to invite some vocal articulation here. Are they wrong or are they right, and why?
David, this is Jackie Julian. In conversation in our, what I've shared is, I think that it can be both, right? When we think about stock stories, and then we think about concealed, in order to disrupt the stock, right, we have to come with the concealed. But when we think about media outlets and what's being portrayed, it keeps us in the constant stock mentality mind frame. So for someone who believes, or right, maybe they're a regular on Fox News, that stock story is very real for them. It's constantly regurgitated, it's constantly coming in. So I think that they can, I don't know that it's, we know that, right, it's a false narrative. We know that it's misleading, and the history behind it, but I think it could be both. If that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense. Thank you, Jackie, for sharing that. Anyone else? Any other alternative views or perspectives?
I'm not sure this is an alternative view. This is Catherine from Island County. Given the definition of stock stories that you gave us, it seems as though they're meant to describe a desire or a goal of a group, whether it be good or not, true or not, but a desire to convince the rest of the group to think and feel that way and believe that it's true. thus controlling a narrative. We talked a little bit about stereotype threat in our group and how that can impact individuals and their ability to even feel as though they're a part of the stock story. So I think that, you know, based on that definition, that it is not truth, but it's a desire for an agreed upon truth, whether or not it really is backed up by data or not.
Yeah, great point and analysis, Catherine. You know, I'm reminded of the word aspirational, you know, and you've heard a lot of people talk about how the ideals, you know, in a lot of our early framing documents were more that than anything, and give a certain amount of credit to the founding fathers for those positions and stance, which weren't, not only, they were not a part of the broader culture and way of thinking, feeling, and believing, they weren't even a part of their own lives to a large degree. You know what I'm saying? So that's definitely a 50-50 proposition in terms of where you could go with that. Anyone else? Anyone else? Right or wrong? Stock stories.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about this, and I know that Liz said earlier that they frequently are used to conceal a different kind of narrative, and I think that goes along with their right or wrongness being sort of beside the point, because they're not meant to be like a strict recitation of historical fact, just as a kind of a narrative or rhetorical tool. So I think some stock stories are more true than others, and maybe how true they are changes over time too. But whether they are strictly true or not, I think is sort of not really important to the people who are creating them and using that tool.
Say more about that. Not important to the people who are creating them and using that tool, and elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, just that, you know, all those stories are meant to construct a particular narrative or a particular understanding of the way we view our society. And like I think some other people have said in the chat, to kind of protect certain groups or idolize certain groups, certain ways of life, all to, you know, a particular end. And not to say that it's some sort of like really intentional individual construction process, you know, that it's just a natural building of these stories that happens over time, because people who have the same feelings and same perspectives are in positions of power, and they want to make those perspectives, you know, broadly accepted. So I think it makes sense. It's an easy thing to happen if you have the same sorts of people who are in positions of power and who agree and are kind of propagating those stock stories or those kind of cultural myths as broadly as possible. I don't know if that really answered your question though.
I don't know either, but you know, I've got a question, you know, that I'll leave as rhetorical because I got somebody who wants to respond maybe to you, Jamie, and that's, I think, Chastity. Chastity, you had a response to Jamie?
Oh, my response wasn't to Jamie, but just more to the question of our stock stories wrong or right.
Okay. All right. So I'll issue my rhetorical question to Jamie, but it's actually to everyone. You know, beyond the right or wrong, think about the impact. What's the effect of stock stories, and how does that show up in our society, and particularly, without a doubt, in the last, you know, 4 or 5 months or so? So that's a question I'm gonna leave out there for a minute, and I'm gonna point out a couple of comments in the chat. Melissa gave one example: white culture is under attack. and I'm presuming maybe she's talking about that as a stock story. Ben says stock stories provide plausible deniability. You know, maybe we all understand that. Ben, you want to break that down for anyone who may not necessarily understand what you mean by that?
Sure. It is the it is when you call someone on the line or their stock story, they start defending their position through saying, "Hey, that's not what I meant. What I'm trying to say is, or what I meant was," as opposed to actually, it gives them a shield to hide behind when they are actually trying to, when you call them correctly out on their stock story. I want to say something else, but that the stock story is good enough.
You had another term you could have used there?
Not in polite company.
Not in public company. All right. So Chastity, I want to provide you an opportunity to jump back in with your note. You wanted to not necessarily comment on Jamie, but you know, you had a comment that you wanted to make.
Yeah, just in general, I think it's easy to think of stock stories as being something that's stated in the positive, but that's not always the case. I think a good example of that is low-income housing complex will lower home values in your neighborhood. That's sort of maybe a myth or more of a stereotype, but it's the stock story that there's a certain class whose home values deserve to be protected and maintained, while the concealed side of it would be that there's the low-income individuals who might live in those complexes that don't deserve to be located there at the expense of lowering somebody else's housing values.
Mm-hmm. You know what, Chastity, what you're bringing up and the example you just gave, without a doubt, you know, really illustrates the fact that a lot of this is very complicated and you've got multiple layers. And in many cases, we're trying to roll up very complicated dynamics and circumstances, what our colleague Bobby Milstein likes to call tangled threads, into very simplistic statements. And so, you know, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, that in your example, you really surfaced some of the complexity of what we're talking about here. But what I want to do, just to kind of keep us moving, we've got another round of dialogue we want to get to. One of the most simple and yet powerful statements that I heard, it was when we were in San Juan doing a similar session like this, when the question was asked, are stock stories right and wrong, or wrong, was given by one of the members of the San Juan community, when he said, depends on who you ask. Depends on who you ask. And so you'll see that at the bottom of our little debrief segment there. And that's the truth. Stock and concealed stories are solely and largely, you know, if we look at how they play themselves out in social dynamics, largely about who's in and who's out. And so depending on who you ask about any particular stock story will define what kind of answer you get in terms of right or wrong. And a lot of that is about the cultural and social context in which those individuals live. One of the, you know, features of our social media age is that we've learned so much about how we live in our own insular bubbles, you know, and they're echo chambers of what we already know, feel, and hear, you know, and experience, and they reverberate with the stories within our chamber. And so Elizabeth Jennings just chatted something that looks interesting. If anyone wants a great simple model for how values impact values and values impact stories and stories impact policies and budgets, see page 30 of the governor's 10-year plan to end poverty on inequality. That's fantastic. And she's even chatted in a resource there. So be sure to click on that link. In this moment, we want to get you to another round of dialogue, but we want to also move forward in talking about how you can use stock and concealed stories to change hearts and minds and to direct positive change. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about narrative change. And it begins with a better understanding of, well, what are the ways in which a concealed story kind of counteracts the stock story. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see there, these are characteristics and ways in which a concealed story can counteract a stock story, you know, and number one on the checklist is it's true. And it's not, you know, true as an anomaly. You know, it's not that individual one-off, 1 out of a billion kind of example, but it has a level of generalizable application to a significant portion of the population. So in other words, it's not an isolated incidence, all right? Another characteristic is that it's verifiable by data. You know, this is why data and story are the 1-2 punch, you know, to really change and transform hearts and minds. And then the last example here is that in our context of advancing equity, it's likely to have some attributable and attribution, to systemic and structural failure. So there's probably a wide range of stock and concealed stories that apply to a wide number of different things. But in our work, we're interested in the stock and concealed stories that are most attributable and held in the context of systems and structures. All right. Personally / professionally, one of the places I've arrived at is, you know, maybe putting, you know, the effect of systems and structures even over top of, you know, kind of like that individual one-on-one kind of either racist or homophobic or, you know, gender, you know, ism kind of reality. Is what are the systems and structures doing, you know, is a key question for us in regards to stock versus concealed stories. And so what we want to do now is in this next round of dialogue, next slide, please, is we're going to examine who in our breakout group may have had examples and experiences of narrative change work that you've been involved in. For example, a minute ago, Elizabeth just chatted in what she saw around the values impact, you know, in the governor's 10-year plan. Doesn't necessarily mean that she had an experience around narrative change. Most of us haven't had experiences around narrative change. But if there's someone in your group that has, invite them to speak and share and elucidate a little bit of what their experience was like. What was some of the mechanics and dynamics of it? The second question is, what questions are coming up for you? So as you're listening to someone, what kind of questions are coming up for you about why or how you might use stock and concealed stories in your work? And again, here's where you want to think right from the vantage place of where you are, the vantage point of where you are right now. You know, right where I am, how can I see stock and concealed stories beginning to have value, you know, not just in a one-on-one interpersonal, because there is a value there once you develop a level of command. But how does it get woven into the very mechanics and infrastructure of the work that I do? How does it get woven into, you know, this idea of changing narrative, changing values, changing perspective? How does it get woven in? Elevating data, you know, elevating reality, if you will, and other people's reality, which we know there's little r reality, which is relative, which is what stock and concealed stories are all about. What group do you belong to? A lot of times we're not aware of what's the alternative perspective here, not just a competing narrative, which kind of sounds somewhat hypothetical, but what are people living? What are the realities that people are living that aren't included in our frame of view? Okay. And then the last question is, what ideas do you have about how we could use stock and concealed stories to advance narratives in North Sound, whether it's related to health equity, racial justice, whatever the case may be? So we're looking for those individuals who may have had some experience. By all means, if you find yourself in a group that no one says, hey, I've never done narrative change before, then switch into an innovative mode, you know, like especially questions number 2 and 3. What questions are coming up for you about how and why you might use stock and concealed stories? And then just what ideas do you have, whether they've been tried, true, and tested or not? Have an exploratory dialogue around these questions. So with that, we're going to send you into another round of breakouts. I hope you enjoy it. Be prepared to share vocally when we return. Thank you, Tiffany. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome back. Good dialogues? I am presuming a roaring, resounding yes coming out of your collectively muted voices.
Yes, yes. I can like make up a lot of voices.
There you go. There you go. Voice of many. So, you know, again, we're going to invite you all to, you know, when called upon, and or not, either there's ways you can raise your hand, I learned. So you can raise your hand, kind of study your Zoom room there and figure out that. But we want to invite you to share a little bit. What was an example or two of narrative change? And we realize already this may be the rare, you know, situation where in one of your breakouts, somebody has been through a narrative change process. That's okay. But we're hoping maybe 1 or 2 individuals have, you know, of narrative change work that you heard that was compelling. You know, so if you either heard it or you were the one sharing it. So we want to invite anyone to say a little bit about a narrative change experience that you've had. Anyone?
Liz, is it okay if I share your story? This is Katie.
Absolutely.
Yay,
So
Katie.
Liz talked with me about her work in Oregon, and there was, and I'm sorry, Liz, if I get this wrong, but there was a push for kind of changing some of the legislation around healthcare in Oregon. And the way that it was being talked about and criticized was that it was being seen as socialized medicine, which just created a lot of divide within the Oregon public. And Liz was asked by a group and joined a small group of folks who were committed to trying to understand more about what Oregon wanted in a healthcare system, in you know, what do they value about healthcare. And so she says she spent a whole year, just about 9 months, going around traveling through Oregon and listening to community members talk about what they wanted in experiencing good health. And she was really surprised to hear that there were a lot of similarities in what Oregonians wanted. And by the end of 9 months, when people stopped basically talking to her about what they wanted, she was able to put that into some legislation, which ended up passing. So I think the unique thing was, she said that, was it the Senate, Oregon Senate? I'm not quite sure, but it was 30-30 divide, Democrats and Republicans. But when this legislation came forward, it passed, I think you said 56-4. So really, really significant cross-party agreement on this legislation and the way that it was crafted, because it focused on the values of what Oregonians wanted in good health. I'm sorry if I botched that, Liz.
You did an awesome job. Probably
You did.
better and shorter than I would have said it.
Yeah. That was a great relay there, Katie. Good job. And thank you for lifting it up, Liz. Great story. You know, I'm so tempted to just name the things that I heard in that story that are worth kind of double clicking on, but I'm actually going to put all of you on the spot and invite you. What stood out to you in that story? And I'm going to begin by naming one obvious thing, which is the cry of socialism every time we start to do something that is just good for people. You know, that's the obvious. But what else in terms of how they turned that around did you hear in that story that are things we want to make sure we do not gloss over? What did you hear in that story? Again, good job, Katie. Anyone?
Sounds like Liz did a lot of listening.
That's what I was thinking, Erica. That was like one of the ones I wanted to lift up. So listening, 9 months of listening, you know, and I've got another point to make about that, but I want to invite someone else. Anyone else? What else did you hear?
David, Amanda's offered in the chat, without labeling things, people had similar needs and wants.
The similarities, you know, a byproduct of the listening. One thing I'll just name is stock stories, and, you know, stock stories live at this high level, all right? The listening happens at the level below the stock stories, you know, and the closer you get, you know, the more depth you get in the listening, the more you find the humanity and the commonality of people. And so they literally drove into a level where they were striking the bedrock of common humanity in the ways they probably started to reframe and language and articulate what they were driving for. Anyone else? Anything else?
I think what stood out to me was the timing and the investment of time. And then when it came to the Senate, it was presented in a language that people did not vote Republican, Democrat, or at least some didn't. There was that party where there was no longer a party. It was more like people heard and listened to the narrative, the truth narrative of the work that this group did, that Liz was part of, and that they had evidence and language and terminology from people, real people, saying this is what we need, what we want, and it is good for all of us. And when you can get career politicians maybe to come across their divide and bridge, that shows the work behind it, and it is possible.
Great point, Vanessa, great point. Liz, I'm going to invite you to say any quick comment, you know, about that experience that you also want to point out for us.
Yeah, probably the only thing I would add, and it's been referenced, is that what we ended up with was in language that community members gave to us. So it wasn't in a high level political, and for those who know legislative language, it gets very convoluted. And so throughout that year, like if I heard from a community, they'd like to see this change, the changes were made immediately. So the next community, it was iterative all throughout the process, and everyone could see where their handprints were on creating that alternative story. And that just, it made such a huge difference across the state.
Wow, people saw themselves in the story and eventually in the legislation. You know, we're about a minute out from, I think, showtime or deadline, if you will, but I want to move beyond our debrief slide to the very next slide. And lo and behold, in the last week, I got this email from the Nonprofit Quarterly, and the title said, "Changing Our Narrative About Narrative, the Infrastructure Required for Building Narrative Power." And so right off the bat, I started reading the article, and guess what? It was by our one and only John Powell, all right? And this is a quote I wanted to pull out because this quote to me kind of harkens to where we want to go with this conversation beyond stock and concealed stories to this idea of building what is required as a narrative, an infrastructure, for narrative change. And the quote says, "In the end, we can define narrative infrastructure as the ability to learn, create, broadcast, and immerse, and to do all four things strategically, both sequenced and integrated. So in other words, that kind of means, yes, it may be developmental, one thing builds on another, but it's rarely a straight line, you know, and it's iterative, and it also needs to be integrated, highly integrated. What I hope to do and what we hope to do next time is to really pull out 4 words in this quote: learn, create, broadcast, and immerse. To examine what would that mean, what would that look like, you know, in building this infrastructure for narrative change. Hopefully you found this valuable. We are a minute over time, but hopefully it was worthwhile. I want to thank everyone for your participation. And in closing, we just simply want to say that this particular session, along with the other 2 pre-meeting sessions, can be found on the North Sound link. The North Sound website. We've uploaded them, or we will upload this one to join the other 2. So if any of your colleagues missed any of the previous sessions by John Powell or on Dialogue, you can go to the North Sound website for that. There you'll also find a registration link for our August 5th and 6th North Partners meetings. Please, we hope you have it on your calendar. We do need you to register. We want to be prepared and have a good count of who's going to be online. And the very article that I just mentioned by John Powell around narrative change has also been uploaded to the North Sound link as well. So with that, we're consolidating a bevy of resources for you all, and we look forward to engaging you on the 5th and 6th and doing more learning, capacity building, and preparing for our great future. All right, with that, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, David. Thank
Thank
you.
you, David.